Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
This market again takes a deep breath here. Another cleansing breath as the White House changes course on a couple of pretty significant issues. We're talking tariffs and we're talking about the Fed chair. The tariffs, even at this time yesterday, people were feeling better after Scott Bessent suggested the standoff couldn't last. Unsustainable, must de-escalate. President Trump added to that quite a bit, suggesting that tariffs could be significantly lower, specifically on China, as talks continue. And then the matter of Jay Powell came up. Reporters are in the Oval Office. He was there actually to swear in the new chair of the SEC. You know where the conversation was going to go after Donald Trump threatened to fire the Fed chair a couple days in a row. Not sounding so much like that now. Listen to the president.
No, I have no intention of firing him. I would like to see him be a little more active in terms of his idea to lower interest rates. This is a perfect time to lower interest rates. If he doesn't, is it the end? No, it's not. But it would be good timing. It could have taken place earlier. But no, I have no intention to fire him.
Why? Did you hear something? It was only 48 hours earlier. Actually, 24 hours earlier. Donald Trump posted on Truth Social. There could be a slowing of the economy, he wrote, unless Mr. Too Late, a major loser, lowers interest rates now. He went on to write, Powell has always been too late, except when it came to the election period, when he lowered in order to help sleepy Joe Biden, later Kamala, get elected. How did that work out? Remember, he said he could not be terminated soon enough. And now there's a whole round of reporting about how Scott Bessent and Howard Lutnick walked this one into the Oval Office and pulled the president back from his desire to fire the chair of the Fed, the very man he appointed. And so we're traveling in reverse here when it comes to the messaging and moving higher on Wall Street with our panel in place. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano are with us right now. Jeannie is, of course, Democratic analyst and political science professor at Iona University. Rick, our Republican strategist and partner at Stone Court Capital. So, Jeannie, the headline today is never mind.
That's right. And Joe, I'm trying to be positive on a Wednesday. So I'm going to say there's good news here. Number one is that for the first time, we are seeing that the Trump administration, in at least Trump 2.0, is responding to the market. So that is a good thing. And it shows, really, to your point, how hungry the market is for some good news, even if it's just little tidbits like this. On the negative side, the reality is we are in a situation where the markets are hoping, number one, that Donald Trump doesn't pursue his policies, and number two, that he doesn't mean what he says. So when he says would be great to get rid of Jerome Powell, all of these things, they're praying that he doesn't mean it. So that's a situation we're in, and that is not a very good place for a country to find itself. But it is a little bit of bright light from what's been a pretty tough month through the markets.
Yeah. Well, boy, I guess that's for sure. Rick, these are all market-moving comments, whether it's the president or the Treasury Secretary that we're hearing from. Earlier today, Scott Bessent said, yes, America first, but that does not mean America alone. Is that the difference in the messaging here that's soothing the market?
Yeah, I think that what we're seeing is Trump's reaction not to the markets, but to his advisors and to the corporations that came in on Monday, Walmart, and a few others, talking about empty shelves. And because we've seen the markets gyrate wildly in the 100 days that he's been president, and he hasn't really seemingly cared. But I think when they walk into the Oval Office and they say, hey, look, we've got a problem, boss, he sits up and listens. And so I think that a lot of this isolationism discussion has been a little overwrought. I think, Secretary Bessent's effort to try and rationalize it a little bit was probably a good investment of time today, during the IMF meetings, World Bank meetings, because We are active with multilateral institutions. We're negotiating with the European Union. We're not isolating European countries one by one, which you could have imagined would happen. Trump has, formulated efforts to try and be supportive of these lending institutions that Besant's speaking to. So the reality is, and there are all kinds of engagements around the world around, negotiations with the Iranians on nuclear weapons, negotiations with the Russians and the Ukrainians on stopping the war. Look, I mean, it isn't what you would expect out of a Republican president, but in this case, it is more than you would have expected from Donald Trump, the isolationist.
Pretty amazing stuff here. Jeannie, what's your thought? Do we have Target to thank then or Scott Bessent? Because Rick is right. Walmart, Target, Home Depot, sitting in the Oval Office saying not only are prices going to go up, but you're going to see empty shelves if you continue. That's the imagery that changed Donald Trump's mind, isn't it?
Well, I can't read what changed his mind. He did have those meetings with those big box CEOs. He, seems to be listening a bit to Scott Bessent. But I think the real question here, number one, what is the long-term impact of this policy of protectionism he has been pursuing? And number two, and most importantly, what is the world to think and what are we as Americans to think about a president and a White House who seem to be the gang that can't shoot straight? On the one hand, he says one thing one day, one thing the next day, and it raises real questions about competence. So I don't know if it much matters if he's listening to CEO Scott Bessent or the market. He did pull back what he had said a few hours earlier yesterday, and the markets responded positively. But this is no way to run the global economy or the U.S. economy on these kinds of whims. And, for everybody who feels confident that his attacks on Powell are, a thing of the past, he seems to flip like the wind these days. So I'm not so sure that next week when the Fed has his meeting, he's not going to go back on the attack. Doesn't mean he's going to fire him, but right. The attack could come.
We'll be watching Truth Social, of course. I just wonder when we consider the deal-making aspect of all of this, what the message is to China. Let's go back to the Oval Office last evening and hear Donald Trump on tariffs for Beijing. Listen.
I'm not going to say, I'm going to play hardball with China. I'm going to play hardball with you, President Xi. No. We're going to be very nice. They're going to be very nice. And we'll see what happens. But ultimately, they have to make a deal because otherwise they're not going to be able to deal in the United States. So we want them involved.
Okay, so we're not going to play hardball, Rick Davis. What is the message there to President Xi? We're going to be very nice. Is that the way to set up a meeting?
Yeah, first of all, 145% tariff is hardball. I don't know. That may be a dictionary definition of hardball. It is an embargo against Chinese goods into the United States, once our largest trading partner. So whether or not you're calling them names is one thing, but like when you shut off trade to a country like China that is solely dependent upon it for their economy, it's playing hardball. So it's confusing because we have so many connecting priorities. Everything from military and issues related to Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific to our trade relationships. It impacts everything like climate. China and the U.S. has to find a way to get along. Otherwise, there's conflict. There's conflict economically and militarily, and that is bad for the world. If China gets a cold, we start showing symptoms and vice versa. So this is good news that Donald Trump is seemingly open for business when it comes to negotiating a trade deal with China that's different than the current one. The question I have is, what's China thinking? Because they got to be sitting there in Beijing going, what the heck is going on here?
That's exactly
1
right.
minute, he's waiting for our call. We don't call. She goes around, starts meeting with the Vietnamese and other friends and allies of the United States. And all of a sudden, Donald Trump's tune changes. So, I'm glad it's where it is. And, partly concerned like Jeannie is about what the future brings, because if we're running hot first, cold second, hot first, cold second, It's a new definition of good cop, bad cop, because you're the same person.
I think there's a word for that. Well, I'll tell you what. If it takes 2 years, like Scott Besson said, or 3 to come to a important trade deal with China, we do know one lawmaker who will not be here for it. Pretty important news today, Jeannie. The senator from Illinois is leaving the building. This is Dick Durbin from social media a short time ago.
The decision of whether to run for re-election has not been easy. I truly love the job of being United States Senator, but in my heart, I know it's time to pass the torch. So I'm announcing today that I will not be seeking re-election at the end of my term. The people of Illinois have honored me with this responsibility longer than anyone elected to the Senate in our state's history. I'm truly grateful.
All right. Look, maybe not surprised. We've been waiting on this one, but we're talking about the second ranking Democrat in the United States Senate, Jeannie, a lion, the Democratic Party. Does this say more about Dick Durbin's age or the state of politics in Washington?
44 years is a long time for any of us to be in one job. He's the 5th senator over 65 to retire this term. As you mentioned, not a surprise. I do think it speaks to this recognition we've been seeing on the Democratic side and the Republican side, but the Democratic side, that you do need to make sure you bring up the people who are coming behind you. And there's a lot of good Democrats in the Illinois contingent, on the Democratic side who have expressed interest in running if he was to step aside, including a very popular lieutenant governor. So I do think he knew it was time. I gotta say, Joe, I love the music behind that video. But he has served, very admirably. And I think he sort of paves a way of saying, I'm going to go while I am in a good position, and leaving behind a seat that can be filled by Democrats, they hope.
Mm-hmm. Rick, we've only got about a minute left. You worked with and around Dick Durbin in the United States Senate in your time with Senator John McCain. This stays Democrat, right? This isn't a threat to the seat count for Democrats in the Senate?
They're going to have to spend money. Some of their candidates, Rahm Emanuel, others are lining up. They're going to have a good candidate that comes out of that primary. But remember, Mark Kurt was the last Republican that got elected to the Senate in Illinois. And so it's not a miracle. And yet I would say likely a bad year for Republicans. So I would think the seat probably stays the same. But Durbin was a class act, worked well with John McCain and other Republicans, was bipartisan, and yet knew how to throw a punch.
Well, that's right. We've always enjoyed our conversations with him here on Balance of Power. I hope we'll have more opportunities.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Secretary Besson telling reporters that the U.S. is not looking to unilaterally lower tariffs against China, though perhaps if you're looking for areas of optimism, he did suggest a trade deal with India is getting closer, at least some kind of understanding as to what the broad architecture of that could look like, keeping in mind these deals may take some time to actually fully finalize. But of course, that has been the effort underway in India this week by the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, who had bilateral talks with the Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, and talked about trade. But we also heard from the Vice President while he was in India today about a completely separate issue, and that is ongoing efforts toward ending the war in Ukraine, a peace agreement being reached between Ukraine and Russia. This, of course, as there was a meeting in London today that was supposed to be attended by the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and those at the highest levels in foreign policy in the governments of France and Germany and the UK and Ukraine as well. Rubio didn't go. The envoy, Keith Kellogg, went instead, and this was reduced to kind of a technical level meeting. And this is how the vice president characterized the state of things.
We've issued a very explicit proposal to both the Russians and the Ukrainians, and it's time for them to either say yes or for the United States to walk away from this process. We've engaged in an extraordinary amount of diplomacy, of on-the-ground work. We've really tried to understand things from the perspective of both the Ukrainians and the Russians. What do Ukrainians care the most about? What do the Russians care the most about? The current line, somewhere close to them, is where you're ultimately, I think, going to draw the new lines in the conflict. Now, of course, that means the Ukrainians and the Russians are both going to have to give up some of the territory they currently own.
Another suggestion of walking away, echoing Marco Rubio, who made that reference on Friday, knowing that Donald Trump campaigned on a promise to end this war. As he said, he was the only one who could do it. He would end this within hours on day one. He's speaking very differently today on Truth Social. President Trump referring to comments from Volodymyr Zelensky, as he says, boasting on the front page of the Wall Street Journal that Ukraine will not legally recognize the occupation of Crimea. It's a long post. Donald Trump goes on to write, it's inflammatory statements like Zelensky's that makes it so difficult to settle this war. He has nothing to boast about. The situation for Ukraine, he says, is dire. He can have peace or he can fight for another 3 years before losing the whole country. That's where we start our conversation with Melinda Herring, non-resident senior fellow, Atlantic Council, and a voice of experience when it comes to all things Ukraine. Melinda, it's great to have you back. Is that where this is going, losing the whole country?
Not quite, Joe. And there's a few other factual errors in Donald Trump's statement that he put out. So he says, why didn't Zelensky and all of Ukraine fight for Crimea when the Russians illegally annexed it? And the Ukrainians, he forgets that the Ukrainians didn't have any money, that there was no way to fight back. And I think that's an important point as well. But no, things are not headed in a good direction. We know that the White House has lost patience with negotiations, and they found this entire negotiation exercise much more difficult than they expected.
Well, and certainly President Trump has suggested that Volodymyr Zelensky himself is contributing to that difficulty. The U.S. position seems to be, Melinda, that Ukraine is going to have to be willing to give up some territory if they ultimately want a settlement in this war. Is that the wrong way of thinking about this? How could they possibly reclaim all the territory that has been lost, Crimea included?
Hey, Keely, I don't think that's actually the stumbling point. So we've seen a 7-point peace plan, and that's what we thought they were going to be arguing about in London. And the real stumbling points are the U.S. is asking Ukraine to give up NATO membership. It's also asking it also wants to recognize Crimea as legally Russian. And this, I think it's worth reminding our audience, back in 2018, when Donald Trump was president the first time, the State Department issued something called the Crimea Declaration, and it said that we will never, ever recognize the use of force to take territory, that this is illegal under international law. So if you go back to Donald Trump's first administration, the policy that they're trying to push now is not very consistent. I mean, look, it's politics. No one's very consistent, but it's worth pointing out that they're in a very different position. So I don't think Zelensky is willing to concede some territory. I think he understands he has to, but the real issue is there's no security guarantees. And the U.S. is unwilling to give them security guarantees, and the British government has said that it must have a U.S. backstop. So we're sort of stuck. We're very stuck. But there's a bigger issue that I'm really worried about. So when Donald Trump and J.D. Vance say, we're pulling out, I want to know what that means. Does that mean we're not going to participate in the process, or does that mean we're not going to cooperate with intelligence sharing, and we're not going to allow Europe to buy weapons for Ukraine? If it's the second, Ukraine is in a really hard spot. If it's we're not going to participate in the negotiations, I'm a lot less worried.
Interesting. In the end, though, Melinda, you've been talking to us since before the invasion actually took place. Every wrinkle, we've had a chance to get your analysis. Do you see any world in which there is a peace deal struck that does not favor Russia?
So I think it depends on the facts on the ground, but Ukraine is not going to agree to anything, Joe, unless there's some kind of security agreement to ensure that Russia doesn't come back. So right now, Russia occupies 20% of Ukraine, and they're likely going to have to give up some territory. But when I talk to medics on the front line, Joe, they tell me that we are totally committed to defending Ukraine, even if the U.S. is not there. So the mood in Ukraine has not changed, but I don't think the situation is ripe for negotiations at this point.
Well, Melinda, I want to return to your point about kind of characterizing what walking away actually means for the United States. If it were to be just we are removing ourselves as a third party in these negotiations, leaving it for either other countries to mediate or Ukraine and Russia to sort this out among themselves, would that actually make it easier for the Ukrainians, or does that make the whole thing more difficult because Vladimir Putin may not want to go ahead or essentially take this directly to Zelensky?
So the negotiating format is a little bit difficult, Kaylee. So right now, Putin is saying that he's willing to meet with Zelensky. And Zelensky has said before, I will not meet with him directly, that there has to be an intermediary. Zelensky is now saying, I'm willing to consider all formats, but you have to stop killing civilians. And that's one of the difficulties is Russia has not stopped its missile strikes. So that is a prerequisite for any kind of negotiation. To your bigger point, though, if the U.S. were to step back from being the lead negotiator, I think it's not the end of the world. I think Britain could take that place. I think that Turkey would be interested in taking that place. I think there's some Middle Eastern governments that might be willing to take that place. And Ukraine doesn't see Washington as a neutral actor at this point. Every one of the positions that they've been pushing in these negotiations is seen from Kiev as something that doesn't favor them. So I don't think it's a terrible thing if Washington walks away from the negotiations.
There was a time, Melinda, when peace appeared to hinge on the signing of a minerals deal. Remembering Scott Bessent's ill-fated trip to Kyiv, we're still, according to President Trump, expecting something to happen. Here's what he said about a minerals deal potentially happening this week.
We have a minerals deal, which I guess is going to be signed on Thursday, Scott, next Thursday, soon.
Yes.
And I assume they're going to live up to the deal, so we'll see. But we have a deal on that. No, I have no comment on that. I have no idea. That's his statement, not mine.
All right, so that was last Thursday. Melinda, will it still happen?
Joe, I don't know. I've been poking around on this. The expectation is that it was going to be signed tomorrow. That was 5 days ago where the initial agreement was signed between the United States and Ukraine. And it's an 80-page document. The details of that document haven't been released yet. But what's interesting is that the 7-point negotiating document that the United States gave Ukraine, one of the points was the mineral deal. So it seems like the mineral deal is contingent on Ukraine going along with this bigger plan that President Trump and Vice President Vance had envisioned. So I think it looks like it's in trouble, but let's watch and see.
Well, we certainly will be on watch tomorrow to see whether or not this deal ultimately is signed or if there's any progress toward it in the first place. But the original basis for it, Melinda, was that having an economic incentive or economic interest in Ukraine would be some kind of security guarantee. And obviously, we've discussed that thoroughly with you. In the absence of a deal being signed and the U.S. still not being willing to pony up on any other kind of security guarantees, what position does that realistically leave Ukraine in? I'm just trying to consider their position here as they decide whether or not to sign on the dotted line.
Right. So Ukraine is going to put increasing pressure on European governments, London in particular, to make good on the commitment to put troops on the ground and provide some kind of security backstop without Washington. I think that's where we're going next. And I wasn't privy to the discussions today. I'm sure that was discussed in London. And I think there'll be increasing pressure on Ukraine's other friends in Asia and in other parts of the world to deliver military kits so that Ukraine can stay in the fight and defend itself.
Was this always the direction we were going in here, Melinda? We're just kind of getting to the reality of the matter now? Or did that meeting in the Oval Office send things off the rails and potentially permanently for President Zelensky?
Joe, it's a great question. I've been told that President Trump was actually in a good mood and wanted progress in the relationship that day. And we still don't know why it was spiked. I think it's possible that Donald Trump, look, never say never with Donald Trump, right? It's possible he'll wake up tomorrow and say, I'm fed up with Vladimir Putin. He's unwilling to move. I don't see it happening, though, at this point. I think that Donald Trump wanted an easy deal. This is not going to be an easy deal. And I think he's going to move on, unfortunately, for 40 million Ukrainians.
Wow.
Wow. So Steve Witkoff, as he gets ready to head to Moscow, and Vladimir Putin has no real hope of success in your mind, Melinda?
Look, you can't force the Ukrainians to sign a deal that won't bring them lasting security. So I don't see how this deal goes forward. This is Witkoff's fourth trip. I think they're going to discuss the peculiarities of this agreement. But Zelensky's already come out and said that accepting this agreement would violate the Constitution of Ukraine, and no president can do it.
Well, Melinda, I'm not sure what happens from here. What signs should we be watching for? Is it a meeting that includes Marco Rubio and Witkoff that would get your attention? What are you going to see that you might take seriously?
I'm going to be watching the battlefield. That's my eye is in Sumy in northern Ukraine. I want to see what the Russians are doing there, and I'm going to continue to watch and see. There's some interesting reports that North Korea is also sending workers to Russia, Joe, which indicates that Russia doesn't have enough people to be fueling its economy. So I don't think much is going to happen on the high level negotiations, but the real issue is the security guarantees and also the production of weapons in Europe. So watch that space.
All right, we will be, and we trust you will be as well, and continue to come back and share your insights with us. Melinda Herring, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, joining us here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Watching stocks rise today, including Tesla. Charlie's been checking Tesla for a couple of reasons here, and it brings us back to the late edition of Balance of Power, right after the bell yesterday. Worst quarter in years was the headline. But look at the stock, up 6%, $14, back above 250, because it looks like they're going to get Elon back. Yeah, that's the story that we're following here in Washington. Of course, we've talked so much about his work at the Doge, with another headline, Musk to refocus on Tesla after its worst quarter in years. And you know, we've been looking at the end of May here, if you listen to this program, remembering, of course, that that's the deal, 130-day limit. I guess unless they re-up this deal, his role as a special government employee, that would kind of round things out by the end of May. My only real question is, does he get to keep the chainsaw? Elon Musk did speak to investors on the quarterly conference call following the results last evening. Listen.
Starting probably in next month, May, my time allocation to Doge will drop significantly. I'll have to continue doing it for, I think, probably the remainder of the president's term, just to make sure that the waste and fraud that we stop does not come roaring back.
He called his work at the Doge, quote, mostly done, unquote, raising a whole new load of questions here inside the Beltway about what exactly the Doge has accomplished. Elon Musk promising in the outset to cut $2 trillion in spending, waste, fraud, and abuse. And it might not come anywhere near that number, although we're going to be talking a lot more about rescissions when lawmakers get back to town, and you can park that here for a moment. It's not very often I get to spend time with Ed Ludlow. It's usually a big deal involving a rocket launch, so that should tell you how important this story is today. He's with us from our bureau in San Francisco, of course, the co-host of Bloomberg Technology, our Elon whisperer at the moment. Ed, it's great to see you, and I appreciate this. This is really what investors were looking for. Does Elon Musk mean it? Is he going to be showing up at the Tesla plant? What's his new life going to be like, the one he used to lead?
I mean, that's a pretty good summary. It was the only metric that mattered. You know, we asked going into the earnings print, how do you gauge someone's commitment to something? And he opened the call saying, exactly that. As of next month, May, he will drop the amount of time that he spends with Doge and boost the allocation of time for Tesla. But you make a really good point, which is, depending on who you ask, this was or wasn't a surprise, right? We've known for quite a long time that a special government employee has a 130-day limit on their contributions, even if they're unpaid. And we've all been looking at the calendar and thinking what happens at the end of May. But it's just sort of the public coming out and saying, don't worry, I'm coming back to Tesla and I'm focused on the big picture stuff.
Fascinating. What happened to the company in this quarter, Ed, and how much did politics have to do with it?
Yeah, there's a lot of politics to discuss. I mean, there were contradictions between the statements that Elon Musk made on the earnings call and the statements made by his CFO. The CFO quite clearly addressed the issue that in the first quarter, there is what he referred to as brand damage and vandalism that impacted first quarter sales. Elon Musk opened his remarks just before he kind of announced he would step back from Doge, saying he recognized a backlash. So, and what's interesting is that there's more than just about the United States here. You know, there's a lot of evidence that we have protests in the United States. Elon Musk made unsubstantiated claims that they were sort of a targeted and paid for campaign against him, and that has impacted Tesla's sales. But the politics extends to China, right, where Tesla is under pressure from domestic players in China. And if you're a Chinese national, would you buy a Tesla or champion your own domestic brand right now, knowing that Elon Musk is an associate of President Trump in this trade scenario?
Mm-hmm. You know, you see polls, Ed, you've been in business news long enough. You see polls, right, what brand association people have, whether they're from the left or the right. They've got their own beer. They've got their own car. In this case, they've really got their own car. But to watch that transition from being a darling on the left, right, with making the most successful EV ever made in this country, to the complete political opposite, makes you wonder how much permanent damage is done here.
Yeah, and it's hard to quantify. I mean, within the data, there is also a debate about whether the softness in the first quarter reflected Americans who were existing Tesla owners and had become disgruntled or disenfranchised with Elon Musk, or whether Elon Musk's profile and relationship with government was holding off first-time buyers of a Tesla product. We just don't know. But it's an excellent question. I think what was also so interesting is just the tariffs debate. You know, Elon Musk is closely aligned with the president, as you know. But he did say, I don't believe in high levels of tariffs. I believe in low tariffs. And I advocated that position to the president, but it's not up to me. It's up to the president. And in the context of an earnings call, that's not unprecedented, but a little bit surprising, right? It's something that doesn't happen in the daily course of my job. Yeah.
No, that was fascinating, and I wonder, Ed, if that was the breaking point. I'm not sure we'll ever know. But was it the political tug to have to get back to, and of course the investor tug to get back to the company, to get the stock moving again, to have a better story to tell at Tesla? Or was it, hey, you know what? I don't believe in tariffs, so I think maybe our work here is done?
In any company, it's not just the CEO, right? And in any company earnings, the literal statement, the report, and the call, the IR team is involved, the legal team is involved, and the CFO is involved. And it said very clearly in the earnings deck that the company recognizes a changing political landscape without defining geographically where it recognized it, and an evolving trade policy. And they're all impacted by that. And it was a big moment where, you know, we know about the disagreements within the cabinet, Musk and Peter Navarro not necessarily getting on, but this was a company in regulatory filings recognizing what's happening around the world right now. And while Tesla is more insulated than other American companies because it has a very onshored, vertically integrated supply chain, it basically said, like, this isn't good for us, and our opinion on it is this. And that was an important moment. It was an indirect message to this administration. I think that's a fair interpretation.
Tell me about the man, Ed, before I ask you about some other stuff that I wanted to talk to you about. Much has been said about Elon Musk's lifestyle, and there have been a lot of questions about the stress levels he's been under. He talked about how difficult it's been trying to do all of this. There have been questions about his sobriety. There have been questions about, my gosh, this piece about all the kids and the mothers that he's dealing with. Is he well?
Elon Musk has the lifestyle of someone that is atypical for the everyday person. He is on and off the world's richest person. That's an understatement. Look, I know a lot of people that have worked for and with Elon Musk across all of his companies for a really long time. He is a micromanager. He likes to make decisions. He likes to be told, tell me why I am wrong. He spends a lot of time on private jets, working off of his cell phone. But the story has been, has he been too focused on Doge and been operating in Mar-a-Lago and DC too much relative to Tesla's facilities? But he's also credited with some of the biggest technological breakthroughs that humankind's seen in the domain of energy, EVs, rocketry. And I think that this whole debate was about that. Like, he's good at that stuff. So if he focused more on it, then there might be progress in those fields. And it's also important to reflect that lots of times Elon Musk makes bold predictions and timelines that he gets the timing wrong, but he does often get there in the end with a product or whatever.
Isn't that right? Fascinating story. As we got our hooks into Ed Ludlow, I need to ask you about Intel. It's an important headline. Yeah. Plans this week to cut over 20% of its staff. I'm sitting in Washington. You're in San Francisco. So the question I'm supposed to ask you is, did the Biden administration pick the wrong company?
Yeah, you'd think that Intel would be the national champion, right? It is both a designer of semiconductor products and a manufacturer of them, a domestic manufacturer. And Intel's been very frustrated with the CHIPS Act because the money has not really been forthcoming. The intended impact of it's not yet happened. What we're reporting is that they're cutting 20%, but it's not just about bloat. It's about kind of getting focused on technology. There are lots of middle managers at Intel that are involved in making decisions that mean good decisions don't happen. And Intel is trying to find a way to kind of get back to their heritage, which is being the leader in the field of semiconductor manufacturing at the cutting edge of technology. What they want to do is very much in line with what the Trump administration wants to do with onshoring manufacturing. And so I'm so curious to hear when they report numbers. Has anyone from the administration phoned them? Or if they phoned the administration, that would be a big piece of news.
Absolutely fascinating. And more broadly, when you consider the semiconductor space, Ed, how would you describe this industry right now? Obviously, we're in flux. We're dealing with export controls. Yes. We've seen an enormous amount of damage here to NVIDIA shares, for instance, over the past couple of weeks, despite a great meeting between Jensen Huang and Donald Trump. But we're drawing a line around Taiwan here and trying to figure out how quickly they can pull this off.
It's the $100 billion question. We don't have enough time for me to answer it in full. But basically, there are American chip companies that all design chips that are right now in vogue. We are talking about GPUs or accelerators that go into data centers to train AI models. Intel's fallen behind in that space. NVIDIA largely has a monopoly. The key point about a company like NVIDIA is it's what's called a fabless chip company. It designs the chips, someone else makes them, as you just said, TSMC. The supply chain, therefore, has the critical part, the manufacturing of the chip, in Taiwan. That is not China, but of course, in the context of renegotiating the world order for trade, it's an important factor. China's also a critically important end market for all of these names, be they smartphone chip makers, be they in the data center business. And what they want to find out is, if I make a chip somewhere in the world outside the United States, is there a business for me in China? And we don't have an answer to that yet. I saw the headlines from Besant today. It doesn't answer the question of what happens next in that sector specifically.
It sure doesn't. So we got to keep talking about it. Ed Ludlow, a journalist and a broadcaster, peaking right now. Ed, come on more often and talk to us. He co-hosts Bloomberg Technology. He does have a full-time job, but we'll try to pull him into this conversation as often as we can. Really interesting stuff. This is, again, the intersection, once again, of Wall Street, Washington, and in the case of Ed Ludlow, San Francisco, the technology sector. You can't pull one leg out of the stool. Ed, thank you. Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.